My name is Catherine, and I spent the first 22 years of my life living as a completely invisible shadow inside my own home. I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, and while most people think of family as a safe place, my family dynamic was built entirely on incredibly toxic favoritism. I was a full-time architecture student working tirelessly to build a solid future, but my parents never seemed to notice my massive efforts. While I meticulously maintained a perfect academic record and worked 30 grueling hours a week at a local cafe just to independently fund my demanding degree, my parents poured absolutely all of their financial resources and emotional attention directly into my older sister. Her name was Victoria, and she was the undeniable golden child of our family who never actually had to work a single day in her entire life. Every single semester, our parents happily paid her expensive tuition with absolutely no questions asked, while I desperately counted my small tips just to afford my basic rent and textbooks. The incredibly unfair dynamic in our house reached an extreme new level when Victoria suddenly announced her grand engagement to a wealthy heir. From that exact moment forward, the entire household dynamic aggressively shifted to exclusively revolve around her lavish wedding preparations. My parents completely transformed our home into a wedding planning headquarters, and I was constantly expected to sacrifice my vital study time just to run trivial daily errands for them. They constantly demanded that I pick up fabric samples or confirm expensive catering menus right in the middle of my final exams. I was treated much more like an unpaid personal assistant than an actual daughter. Whenever I tried to gently remind them that I had a massive thesis to finish, my mother would coldly tell me that I was being completely selfish and that Victoria needed all the family support she could possibly get for her big life. Transition. The absolute worst part of this toxic environment was how they completely dismissed my own massive life achievements. I worked myself to absolute physical exhaustion and was officially named the valedictorian of my graduating architecture class. But when I proudly shared this massive news with my parents, they barely even looked up from their endless wedding magazines. They simply viewed my fierce independence not as a beautiful virtue but as a highly convenient excuse to entirely ignore my basic human needs. They constantly told their friends that I was so self-sufficient that I never needed their help. They firmly established a deeply toxic environment where I was actively forced to set myself on fire just to keep my family warm. I was completely invisible to them until the exact terrifying day my physical body finally gave up and my entire world collapsed. If you have ever felt completely forgotten by the very people who are supposed to love you the most, then you know exactly how painful this invisible cage truly is. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below because today I am going to tell you exactly how this toxic dynamic almost cost me my entire life. The sheer depth of their blatant favoritism culminated in an absolutely devastating betrayal just a few short weeks before my official graduation ceremony. I had spent 4 entire years working myself to absolute physical exhaustion while quietly enduring their constant neglect. One evening, I walked into the kitchen and finally confronted my mother asking if they were fully prepared for the upcoming commencement weekend. I casually mentioned that I needed to find a proper dress and hoped we could maybe go shopping together. Without a single ounce of guilt, my mother did not even look up from her wedding planning magazines. She casually revealed that the entire family would actually be skipping my once-in-a-lifetime academic milestone completely. I stood there completely frozen as she excitedly explained that they had joyfully accepted an all-expenses-paid luxury vacation to Rome. The entire European trip was being generously funded by the wealthy fiancé of Victoria, strictly to celebrate their recent engagement. When I desperately tried to remind my mother that I was the valedictorian of my graduating class and had to deliver a massive speech, she cruelly justified her heartbreaking decision with a completely twisted logic. She firmly claimed that Victoria was going through a major life transition by getting married and therefore she desperately needed all of their emotional family support. My own father completely agreed with her and coldly dismissed my valedictorian achievement by stating that I was always so self-sufficient that I simply did not need them. They honestly viewed my fierce independence as a convenient excuse to completely abandon me on the most important day of my academic career. I was completely shattered by their cruel words, but because I was so deeply accustomed to being their absolute last priority, I quietly swallowed my immense grief. I walked out of the kitchen and decided right then that I would bravely face the grand commencement ceremony entirely alone. But the overwhelming stress of running their endless wedding errands while finishing my grueling architecture thesis began taking a massive physical toll on my body. I started experiencing severe and blinding headaches that would radiate intense pressure right behind my eyes. I also started having terrifying heavy nosebleeds right in the middle of the night that would not stop for 15 minutes straight. Instead of seeking urgent medical help, I tragically ignored every single warning sign my failing body gave me. I simply swallowed more painkillers and falsely convinced myself that it was just normal stress. I was so determined to prove I could survive without their love that I was literally walking right into a massive medical disaster. On the incredibly important morning of the grand commencement ceremony, the immense physical toll of my profound emotional neglect finally caught up with me entirely. I woke up with a violently pounding headache that felt exactly like a massive, heavy stone pressing directly against my fragile skull. I had actively spent the last 3 agonizing days desperately suppressing these severe migraines with handfuls of heavy painkillers. I was falsely attributing the terrifying medical symptoms to simple academic exhaustion from finishing my massive architecture thesis. When I finally arrived, the university campus was already completely buzzing with loud, joyful activity. There were incredibly proud families standing absolutely everywhere, holding bright balloons and snapping beautiful celebration photos. I desperately tried my absolute best not to look at them while I quietly put on my traditional heavy academic gown. The morning sun was blazing incredibly hot, and the thick black fabric aggressively absorbed the intense heat exactly like a massive furnace. I stood completely alone near the side of the massive wooden stage, nervously waiting for my exact turn to speak. Suddenly, my specific name echoed loudly across the giant speakers, officially announcing the valedictorian of the graduating architecture class. I slowly walked up to the main wooden podium, placing one foot carefully in front of the other, while thousands of people clapped loudly. Standing before an enormous audience of over 4,000 people, the bright stage lights were completely blinding. I nervously gripped the heavy metal microphone and looked out into the vast sea of proud, smiling families. My heart completely shattered into a million tiny pieces when my eyes instantly locked onto 2 specifically reserved chairs sitting right in the very front row. Those 2 chairs were completely empty, because my parents had actively chosen a luxury vacation in Rome over my biggest academic milestone. No one had claimed those premium seats, and the visual proof of their absolute abandonment was entirely devastating to witness. I swallowed my deep emotional tears and fiercely forced myself to begin my carefully planned valedictorian address. I looked at the massive, quiet crowd and started speaking clearly about the profound power of having a strong emotional support system. I told the massive audience that I was standing up there not just because of perfect test scores, but because of the incredible people who actively believed in me. But the exact moment those specific words left my mouth, something went incredibly wrong inside my physical brain. The entire wooden stage suddenly tilted violently beneath my feet, and the bright, blinding lights completely distorted. A white-hot, explosive pain violently erupted directly behind my left eye. My vision aggressively narrowed and started rapidly tunneling down to a single, terrifying dark point. My violently trembling hands completely lost all their remaining physical strength, and the heavy microphone violently slipped right from my fingers. I lost complete physical consciousness, and my failing body heavily hit the hard wooden stage floor in front of thousands of horrified spectators. In a single devastating heartbeat, the entire trajectory of my life completely changed forever. Absolute chaos immediately erupted the exact second my physical body hit that hard wooden stage. I was completely unconscious, but Sarah, my fiercely loyal best friend, later told me the horrifying details of what happened next. Paramedics rapidly rushed onto the stage and loaded me into an ambulance, speeding directly to the nearest emergency room in downtown Boston. The hospital doctors moved incredibly fast, rushing my failing body through various emergency medical scanners. The terrifying medical results completely shocked everyone in the room. The doctors quickly discovered a massive, life-threatening brain tumor that was dangerously pressing right against my frontal lobe. The head neurosurgeon rushed into the crowded waiting room and urgently announced that I required immediate emergency brain surgery to save my life. They desperately needed an official family member to immediately sign the critical medical consent forms within the hour, or I was not going to survive the afternoon. Sarah was in an absolute desperate panic. She aggressively grabbed my cell phone and frantically started calling my parents. The first desperate call went straight to voicemail. The second urgent call went straight to voicemail. Sarah paced the sterile, cold hospital hallway, crying and begging them to pick up the phone. She relentlessly called their mobile phones exactly 47 times, trying to deliver the terrifying news about my collapsing body. Finally, after what felt like an absolute eternity, my father actually answered his phone. He was casually standing right at the boarding gate at the international airport, calmly waiting for their luxury European flight to Rome to take off. Sarah practically screamed through the phone, trying to properly explain the horrific medical emergency. She desperately told him that his youngest daughter had just collapsed in front of thousands of people and was literally minutes away from critical brain surgery. She fully expected him to drop his expensive luggage, completely abandon the luxury vacation, and rush straight to the Boston hospital to save my life. But the verbal response of my father was chillingly apathetic. He sounded completely calm and deeply annoyed by the sudden interruption of his perfect day. Instead of acting like a terrified parent, he coldly stated that their flight was about to board and it would be far too inconvenient to cancel the expensive trip now. He callously argued that the international flight was 12 hours long, so by the time they ever got back to Boston, I would already be completely out of surgery anyway. He firmly stated there was absolutely nothing they could possibly do from the airport. Without a single ounce of genuine emotional concern, he callously instructed Sarah to just call my Grandma Clara to handle all the complicated medical consent forms. He then casually hung up the phone and stepped right onto that plane. My own parents actively chose to fly across the ocean for a celebratory wedding vacation, knowingly leaving their youngest daughter entirely alone to face a potentially fatal brain surgery. After my parents actively chose to board that international flight, I was immediately wheeled into a grueling and incredibly high-risk medical procedure. I thankfully survived the terrifying emergency brain surgery, but my physical body was so deeply traumatized that I remained entirely unconscious for 3 full days. When I finally opened my heavy eyes, the bright fluorescent lights of the sterile intensive care unit were completely blinding. I slowly looked around the quiet hospital room, and I was absolutely not greeted by the relieved, tearful faces of my parents. Instead, I woke up to find my devoted Grandma Clara and my deeply exhausted best friend Sarah sitting close to my bed, gently holding my fragile hands. They had completely refused to leave my side for a single second while I was fighting for my life. As I slowly regained my physical bearings and tried to understand exactly what had happened, Sarah hesitantly handed over my cell phone. She looked at me with deep, profound sorrow in her tired eyes. I slowly opened my social media application, and I was instantly confronted with an absolutely devastating visual image that completely shattered my remaining hope. It was a perfectly curated luxury vacation photo of my parents and my older sister Victoria happily posing right in front of the massive ancient Colosseum in Rome. They were all smiling brightly at the camera, while holding expensive glasses of wine. The public caption, written by my own mother, cheerfully read, "Family trip in Italy, finally no stress, no drama." My own flesh and blood family was openly celebrating halfway across the entire world, blissfully unconcerned that their youngest daughter had literally just survived a massive near-death experience. I was apparently nothing but unwanted stress and annoying drama to them. I stared at the bright glowing screen, and I did not even have the physical energy left to cry a single tear. I spent the next several hours just lying in complete silence, trying to carefully process my massive emotional heartbreak. But suddenly later that exact same evening, my silent phone violently exploded with endless loud notifications. I suddenly received over 60 frantic missed calls and dozens of highly demanding text messages, completely flooding my screen directly from my parents. They were aggressively demanding that I answer the phone immediately and call them back. However, as I would very soon discover from my wise Grandma Clara, this sudden massive barrage of frantic communication was absolutely not born out of any genuine parental concern for my failing health. They did not care about my dangerous brain surgery at all. They were frantically calling me because of an entirely different and deeply selfish financial motive that was about to completely change the trajectory of my entire life forever. I stared at my glowing phone screen, completely confused by the sudden barrage of messages, but the deeply selfish reason behind their frantic phone calls was soon revealed by my Grandma Clara. She was sitting quietly right beside my hospital bed when she gently took my fragile hand and delivered a massive financial revelation. Clara softly explained that my late grandfather Arthur had secretly established a massive and completely irrevocable trust fund. He explicitly called this secret account a freedom fund, and it was intended exclusively for me the exact moment I officially graduated from my college university. But that beautiful gift was only the beginning of the shocking conversation. Clara then took a deep breath and exposed a deeply sickening truth that completely shattered my entire reality. She explained that several years ago she and Arthur had explicitly written two massive financial checks and handed them directly to my parents. The massive amount of money was strictly meant to equally fund both the university tuition of my sister Victoria and my own demanding architecture degree. But instead of actually paying for my education, my parents had maliciously stolen my exact half of the money. They actively used my designated college tuition to fully fund the luxurious daily lifestyle of Victoria and completely remodel their own expensive home kitchen. My own parents intentionally forced me to work grueling 30-hour shifts at the local cafe just to barely survive, while they secretly spent the massive money my grandparents had lovingly provided for my future. When Grandma Clara finally learned that my parents had actively chosen to board that international flight and completely abandon me at the hospital, she became absolutely furious. She immediately called my father at his luxury hotel in Rome and explicitly threatened him with severe financial consequences. She firmly stated that because of their extreme cruelty, she was going to hand the massive trust fund directly over to me without letting my parents act as financial intermediaries or control a single penny of the inheritance. That massive financial threat was the exact reason my phone was suddenly blowing up with dozens of missed calls. My parents were absolutely not panicking because their youngest daughter had just survived a terrifying brain surgery. They were panicking over the sudden, unexpected loss of this massive fortune. Terrified that they would lose complete access to the massive trust fund, my parents finally packed their expensive bags and booked the very next flight back to Boston. The very next afternoon, the heavy door to my sterile hospital room violently burst open. My parents and my older sister Victoria finally stormed inside right after landing their panicked flight from Rome. Any tiny lingering hope I had that they might actually be worried about my physical health was instantly destroyed. They completely bypassed any genuine emotional concern for my terrifying brain surgery and immediately attempted to manipulate the heavy conversation directly toward my newly discovered trust fund. My mother tried to put on a highly fake smile and casually suggested that we needed to discuss the massive financial inheritance as a united family. But I was no longer the weak and invisible girl they had left behind. Heavily supported by my devoted Grandma Clara sitting on my right and my fierce best friend Sarah standing guard on my left, I completely refused to back down. I looked my parents dead in the eye and firmly told them they were absolutely never touching a single penny of my freedom fund. During the explosive verbal confrontation that immediately followed, my mother finally lost her temper and snapped. The meticulously maintained facade of our perfect family completely shattered as she loudly revealed the incredibly toxic and long-hidden truth behind her decades of severe emotional abuse. She stood right in the middle of my hospital room, crying tears of pure, bitter anger, and confessed that she had intentionally isolated and neglected me my entire life for one deeply disturbing reason. She aggressively told me it was simply because I bore a striking physical resemblance to my late grandfather, Arthur. She explained that Arthur had always made her feel deeply judged and fiercely criticized regarding her lower social status when she first married my father. Because she possessed so much unresolved internal trauma and bitter hatred toward him, she actively projected all of her dark insecurities directly onto her innocent youngest daughter. Every single time she looked at my face for the past 22 years, she did not see her own child. She only saw the deeply resented in-law who always made her feel completely worthless. I sat in my hospital bed, absolutely paralyzed by this heartbreaking revelation. For 22 agonizing years, I had desperately tried to earn the basic love of a mother by getting perfect academic grades and working grueling jobs just to make her proud. I was constantly setting myself on fire, hoping she would finally look at me and smile. But hearing her explicitly scream that twisted truth completely shattered any remaining illusions I held about ever having a normal or loving family. I finally realized that my profound childhood suffering was absolutely never my fault, and I was never going to win a psychological battle against a ghost. After the devastating revelation from my mother echoed through the sterile hospital room, a heavy silence completely filled the space. But instead of breaking down and crying like the old invisible version of myself would have done, I felt an incredible surge of pure strength. Armed with the brutal truth and a profound new sense of self-worth, I looked my toxic family dead in the eye. I officially decided right then and there to set unbreakable, ironclad boundaries for my own physical and emotional survival. The heavy silence was suddenly broken when my older sister Victoria arrogantly stepped forward. Completely ignoring the horrifying fact that I had literally just survived a massive near-death experience, she actually demanded that I use my newly discovered trust fund to help pay for her outrageously expensive Italian destination wedding. She audaciously claimed that because we were blood relatives, I somehow owed it to her to share the massive inheritance. I looked at her with absolute disbelief and flatly refused her ridiculous demand. I firmly stated that the massive amount of money was a beautiful gift from my late grandfather Arthur meant strictly to secure my permanent independence. I explicitly told her it was absolutely not a financial bailout for the lavish lifestyle of a golden child who never worked a single day in her entire life. I then turned my attention directly back to my parents, who were standing there completely speechless. I explicitly told them that I was completely done setting myself on fire just to keep them warm. I told them they were no longer allowed to use me as their personal, emotional punching bag to hide their own massive failures. Because they had actively chosen to abandon me at the airport while I was literally dying, I informed them that I had already taken strict legal action. I had my hospital administration officially ban them from ever making any further medical or financial decisions on my behalf. I clearly declared that if they ever wanted to have any kind of relationship with me in the distant future, they would have to undergo intense professional therapy. My mother specifically needed to work through her bitter, unresolved hatred, and they would have to genuinely earn their way back into my life through real, consistent actions. Drawing incredible strength from my recent terrifying brush with death, I officially walked away from their deeply manipulative dynamic. I finally proved to myself that bravely choosing my own peace and walking away from a toxic family is absolutely never a selfish betrayal, but rather the ultimate act of self-preservation. After I officially walked away from their manipulative dynamic and established my ironclad boundaries, the universe finally delivered the exact consequences my family deserved. The instant karma arrived swiftly and brutally, especially for my older sister Victoria. Because Boston has a surprisingly small and highly connected elite social circle, the horrifying news of how my parents intentionally abandoned their youngest daughter during an emergency brain surgery quickly spread like absolute wildfire. When the dark truth finally reached the wealthy fiancé of Victoria, he was completely horrified. Julian and his highly prominent family flatly refused to ever associate themselves with people who could be so deeply heartless to their own flesh and blood. Consequently, Julian abruptly called off the lavish Italian destination wedding and completely ended their grand engagement forever. He walked away, leaving the golden child completely devastated and publicly humiliated in front of her entire social circle. Because Victoria had always been incredibly spoiled, she had recklessly accumulated massive amounts of extreme credit card debt. She foolishly assumed Julian would simply pay for all her luxurious wedding dresses and expensive venue deposits. Suddenly, she was left entirely alone, drowning in massive financial debt, while our parents furiously blamed her for publicly embarrassing our family name. The exact same people who had worshipped her were now actively turning their backs on her. Meanwhile, my father finally began to realize the catastrophic magnitude of his massive parental failures. Watching his perfect family image completely fall apart finally broke through his arrogant delusion. He actually began making highly awkward but surprisingly consistent weekly phone calls to me every single Tuesday evening. He was desperately trying to slowly rebuild the deeply fractured relationship he had completely destroyed through decades of severe emotional neglect. While I cautiously answered his weekly calls, I meticulously maintained my strict emotional distance. I kept our conversations incredibly brief and absolutely never allowed him to cross my newly established boundaries. Watching my former abusers desperately try to pick up the shattered pieces of their own ruined lives was deeply surreal to witness. The profound shift in our family power dynamics firmly proved a beautiful lesson to me. It proved that highly toxic behavior and intentional cruelty will ultimately destroy the very people who actively practice it. While my toxic family was busy dealing with the brutal consequences of their own incredibly selfish actions, I decided to focus entirely on my own healing. Using the highly generous trust fund intentionally provided by my late grandfather Arthur, I finally built the beautiful, peaceful, and completely independent life I always truly deserved. I officially secured a beautiful sunlit apartment right in the heart of Boston where nobody was ever allowed to make me feel invisible again. Shortly after, fully recovering from my brain surgery, I proudly began my brand new career working at a highly prestigious architectural firm. For the very first time in my entire life, I was completely free from the suffocating shadow of my family. Exactly 2 years after that terrifying graduation day, our community held a major evening gala, where my devoted Grandma Clara was publicly honored with a massive Lifetime Achievement Award. I sat proudly in the very front row, right next to my fierce best friend Sarah. When Clara slowly walked up to the bright podium, she looked out into the massive audience and her eyes immediately locked onto mine. In front of hundreds of people, my grandmother emotionally dedicated her prestigious award directly to me. She publicly praised my incredible personal resilience and my unyielding courage to finally choose my own happiness. She told the massive crowd that I possessed the beautiful ability to build a real chosen family out of the exact people who actually showed up when my life became terrifying. Looking back at my deeply painful 22 years inside that invisible cage and the terrifying medical emergency that completely changed my trajectory, I have learned a highly profound lesson. I spent my entire childhood desperately trying to earn the basic love of a mother who only saw a ghost and a father who simply refused to protect me. But surviving that massive brain tumor completely opened my eyes to the real truth and gave me permission to stop performing for people who were not even watching. If you take anything away from my deeply personal journey, please remember this powerful reality. True love does not ever require you to constantly set yourself on fire just to keep other people warm. Bravely walking away from a toxic, unloving family is absolutely never a selfish betrayal. It is the ultimate, beautiful, and entirely necessary act of pure human survival. You absolutely do not owe your beautiful life to people who completely refuse to see your true worth. If you are listening to my story right now and you currently feel exactly like the forgotten invisible shadow in your own home, please know that I see you and your future is worth fighting for. You have the immense power to break free and completely rewrite your own ending. If my incredible journey toward freedom resonated with you today, please hit that like button, share this video with anyone who might feel trapped in their own toxic family dynamic, and completely subscribe to the channel for more powerful, true stories. Let me know your exact thoughts in the comments below because I truly read every single one. Thank you so much for listening to my truth today, and always remember to bravely choose yourself.